At 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon, my secure laptop flashed a single alert. Kinetic trigger, Sector 4. I was sitting 300 miles away in a nondescript office in Washington, D.C., monitoring the flow of illegal funds through offshore accounts for FinCEN. I didn't flinch. I just opened the secure feed from my home office in Greenwich. The image was grainy but unmistakable. My sister, Savannah, was standing in the center of the room. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't even supposed to have a key. But there she was, holding an antique brass key I recognized immediately, the one I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my shelf. She walked straight to the fireproof lockbox, bolted to the floor. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the key into the lock and twisted. The heavy lid popped open. Inside lay a thick stack of Series EE bearer bonds, valued at $750,000. She grabbed them with both hands, her eyes wide, manic. She looked straight at the hidden camera lens, though she didn't know it was recording. She waved the bonds in the air, laughing a soundless laugh. "Found your little savings," she mouthed. "Thanks for the scholarship." Then she turned and walked out, leaving the box open, leaving my life breached. She had no idea she hadn't just stolen my money. She had just put her fingerprints on federal evidence. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community of silent observers. I didn't scream. I didn't reach for my phone to call my parents to beg for an explanation. Panic is an inefficient use of energy during a crisis. Instead, I opened the command terminal on my secure laptop and typed 2 words. Asset compromised. To my family, I was Skylar, the remote data entry clerk who lived in a sad little apartment and probably couponed for fun. They didn't know about the badge clipped to my belt. They didn't know I was a senior special agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and they certainly didn't know what was actually in that box. Savannah thought she had found a nest egg. She thought those Series EE bonds were just my personal savings. Money I had hoarded while claiming I couldn't afford to buy her designer graduation gifts. They weren't savings, they were bait, seized assets from a massive Ponzi scheme I was auditing, temporarily held in a secure transit box before transfer to the Treasury vault. By breaking that seal, Savannah hadn't just stolen from her sister. She had committed federal larceny. She had contaminated a strict chain of evidence in an active RICO case. I watched the recording again, the way she smiled as she looted my life. It wasn't the desperate act of someone in trouble, it was the entitled act of someone who believes the world owes them a living. This is the trap of normalizing cruelty. In toxic family systems, the golden child doesn't view theft as a crime, they view it as a harvest. They are raised to believe that the scapegoat exists solely to provide resources, like a crop waiting to be reaped. Savannah didn't see me as a person with property rights. She saw me as a vending machine that she could kick until a prize fell out. She thought she was clever. She didn't know those bonds were dusted with isotopic tracking ink. It was invisible to the naked eye, but it triggered silent alarms at the Treasury Department the moment it moved outside a geofenced area. I pulled up the tracking software on my phone. A bright red dot pulsed on the map, moving north on the Merritt Parkway. She was heading straight to my parents' estate in Greenwich. They were throwing her a bon voyage party today. A $15,000 garden affair to celebrate her acceptance into a fashion program in Milan. Funded, no doubt, on credit cards they had no intention of paying. I closed my laptop. I activated Protocol Red, Evidence Recovery. Then I walked down to the garage, got into my government-issued SUV, and started the drive. I wasn't going to a party. I was going to a crime scene. I pulled my dusty, government-issued SUV onto the crushed gravel driveway of the Greenwich estate. It looked like a tank, parked amidst a sea of leased Mercedes and Porsches. The house loomed ahead, a colonial revival monstrosity that my parents had leveraged against 3 different shell companies. From the outside, it screamed old money. From my vantage point, knowing the forensic accounting behind it, it screamed foreclosure. I stepped out. I didn't smooth my blazer or check my hair. I wasn't here to impress. I walked toward the garden, where a jazz band was playing something lively and expensive. My mother, Susan, intercepted me before I even reached the hors d'oeuvres. She was wearing a silk caftan that cost more than my first car, holding a glass of champagne that I knew she hadn't paid for yet. She looked me up and down. her lip curling in that familiar, practiced disdain. "You look like a tax auditor, Skylar," she hissed, leaning in close so the neighbors wouldn't hear. "Couldn't you have worn something festive? It's your sister's big day." I looked at her. I saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her hand shook slightly as she gripped the crystal flute. This is the illusion of power of the empty wallet. I've seen it in a dozen fraud cases. The closer a narcissist gets to bankruptcy, the more arrogant they become. They confuse status with substance. They believe that if they project enough wealth, the reality of their zero balance will simply cease to exist. My mother wasn't angry because I looked bad. She was angry because my plainness ruined the aesthetic of her delusion. "I'm here, Mother," I said, my voice flat. "Where is the asset?" "She's over there, being the star," Susan snapped, missing the terminology completely, and tried to smile. "People are watching." I walked past her. I scanned the garden. There she was. Savannah was holding court by the fountain, laughing at something her boyfriend Austin said. And there, stuffed casually into her designer clutch like used napkins, were the bonds. Series EE. $750,000 of federal evidence, exposed to UV light, humidity, and grease from the canapes. My father, Brandon, appeared at my elbow. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, his breath smelling of aged scotch. "Skylar, you made it." He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of conspiratorial benevolence. "Listen, your mother said you might be upset about the loan. We'll talk about the details later, all right? Don't make a scene, it's family money anyway. We all pitch in." The loan, that was their word for it. Not theft, not felony, a loan. I looked at my father's sweating face and realized the extent of the toxic family dynamic. They genuinely believed in the family wallet. In their minds, my bank account, my hard work, and my property were not mine. They were communal resources, held in reserve for the golden child. They hadn't robbed me. They had simply reallocated assets to the department that needed them most, Savannah's ego. They felt entitled to my labor because they viewed me as a utility. I was the generator they kept in the basement, ignored until the lights went out, and then kicked when I didn't produce enough power. "It's not a loan, Brandon," I said. I didn't call him Dad. I hadn't for years. "Don't be petty," he warned, his grip on my shoulder tightening. "Be happy for your sister. She found those papers, finders, keepers, right?" I removed his hand from my shoulder. I didn't shove him. I just stepped out of his reach. "Found," I repeated. "Right." I walked away from him, moving toward the center of the party. I wasn't here to argue philosophy with people who lived in a fantasy. I was here to close a case. I checked my watch. The tactical team was 3 minutes out. I had to secure the asset before the perimeter was breached. I needed to get Savannah away from that fountain. I reached the edge of the patio just as Savannah tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute. The sound cut through the murmuring crowd like a bell. She stood on a raised dais, near the jazz band, looking radiant in a white dress that probably cost more than my entire tuition. She held the clutch in one hand and the bonds in the other, waving them slightly as she spoke. "I just want to say thank you," she announced, her voice trembling with performed emotion, "to my amazing parents, Susan and Brandon. There were rumors that my Milan dream might be put on hold due to some boring financial logistics," she giggled, and a few guests chuckled politely. "But my family always finds a way. Today, thanks to a very generous scholarship contribution found right here in our own home, I am officially going to Italy." The crowd erupted in applause. My mother beamed from the front row, mouthing, "You deserve it." My father lifted his glass in a salute to his own cleverness. I stood there, watching the tableau of lies. They weren't just thieves, they were actors in a play where I was the prop department. Savannah didn't know what it meant to earn something. She thought merit was something you inherited, like a nose shape or a trust fund. I had spent 10 years climbing the ranks of federal law enforcement, analyzing spreadsheets until my eyes bled, conducting stakeouts in freezing vans, earning my authority one closed case at a time. Savannah had simply walked into a room and taken what she wanted. It was the ultimate collision of two worlds, the entitled versus the earned. I stepped onto the dais. I didn't rush. I moved with the measured pace of someone who controls the room. I walked right up to my sister. The applause died down, replaced by confused murmurs. "Skylar?" Savannah hissed, her smile freezing in place but not reaching her eyes. What are you doing? Get down. I didn't whisper. I didn't plead. I projected my voice, using the diaphragm control I learned at the academy. That is not a scholarship, Savannah. Oh my God, you are so jealous, she laughed, turning to the crowd, trying to spin the narrative in real time. Everyone, this is my sister Skylar. She's a little upset that she didn't think to check the family archives first. Those aren't archives, I said, my voice cutting through her performance. That is federal evidence. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of confusion. People looked at each other, wondering if this was a skit. You are holding $750,000 in seized bearer bonds connected to an active RICO investigation, I stated. I looked her dead in the eye. You removed them from a secure federal holding box. That is grand larceny, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Savannah rolled her eyes. You are so dramatic. It's just paper, Skylar. Dad said you weren't even using them. I am not asking as your sister, I said, checking my watch. The red dot on my tracker was blinking furiously. The intercept team was seconds away. I am ordering you as a senior special agent of the United States Treasury. You have 60 seconds to surrender that asset and step away from the guests. If you do not, you will be detained by force. You're an admin assistant, she shrieked, clutching the bonds to her chest like a toddler protecting a toy. Go back to your data entry and leave me alone. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw a girl who had never been told no in her entire life. She truly believed that her desire for the bonds overruled the federal statutes governing criminal evidence. She thought her reality, the one where she was the princess, was the only one that mattered. 50 seconds, I said. Drop the bonds, Savannah. My mother stepped up to the dais, her silk caftan rustling aggressively. She placed a protective hand on Savannah's shoulder, forming a united front of delusion. Oh, for God's sake, Skylar, she spat, her voice dripping with that familiar poisonous condescension. Stop trying to ruin your sister's moment just because you're bitter. It's paper. It is literally just paper. We will replace it when the business liquidity improves. Liquidity. Another finance word she used without understanding the math behind it. My father joined them, shaking his head with a look of disappointed paternity. I thought you were better than this, he said. Calling yourself a special agent? Making up threats? This is pathologic, Skylar. You need help. They were gaslighting me. In real time, in front of 50 witnesses, they were trying to rewrite reality to fit their narrative. They truly believed that if they denied my authority with enough confidence, the federal statutes would simply dissolve. They thought the universe operated on the same rules as their country club membership rules that could be bent if you knew the right people or shouted loud enough. I didn't argue. Arguing is for people who need validation. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket and turned the screen toward them. The map was no longer showing a yellow caution indicator. It was pulsing a deep, angry crimson. I'm not making threats, Brandon, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the emotional plea they wanted to hear. I am reading you the technical specifications of the asset your daughter is holding. Savannah sneered, though her grip on the bonds loosened slightly. What are you talking about? Those bonds were the bait in a trap designed to catch sophisticated financial criminals, I explained, stepping closer. They are dusted with a proprietary isotopic tracking ink. It's invisible to the naked eye, odorless, and impossible to wash off without a chemical solvent only the Treasury possesses. Savannah looked at her hands. She looked at the pristine white fabric of her couture dress. When you broke the seal on that box, I continued, the isotope transferred to your skin. When you put them in your clutch, you contaminated the bag. When our mother touched your shoulder just now, she contaminated herself. Susan yanked her hand away from Savannah as if she had been burned. The guests began to back away, the radius of the circle widening. You aren't just holding stolen money, I said, looking from my sister to my parents. You are currently glowing on a tactical satellite feed. You are a walking, breathing, homing beacon for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. You have led them straight to this garden. You're lying, Savannah whispered, but her voice cracked. She looked at her hands again, rubbing them frantically against her dress, trying to wipe away the invisible stain. Mom, she's lying, right? She's just trying to scare me. I don't have to scare you, I said. I just have to wait. My phone emitted a sharp, piercing chime. It wasn't a ringtone. It was a proximity alert. I tapped the screen and held it up so they could see the countdown. 0 distance. I read aloud. Perimeter breach confirmed. You called the police on your own sister? My mother shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of betrayed victimhood. How could you? I didn't call anyone, I replied, putting the phone back in my pocket. The box called them. The sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel cut through the ambient jazz. It wasn't the polite arrival of a guest. It was the aggressive, accelerated approach of vehicles that do not plan to use the valet. Time is up, I said. The first siren didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a tear in the fabric of their reality. It cut through the jazz quartet's rendition of Fly Me to the Moon with the violence of a knife. Then came the vehicles. 6 unmarked black SUVs surged over the manicured lawn, crushing the hydrangeas and the rented teak chairs. They didn't park, they swarmed. Doors flew open. A dozen agents in raid jackets emblazoned with IRS-CI poured out. They moved with the terrifying synchronization of a machine. The garden party dissolved into chaos. Guests dropped crystal flutes, the sound of shattering glass punctuating the screams. I didn't move. I stood on the dais, a stillness in the center of the hurricane. I watched my sister. For the first time in her life, Savannah couldn't charm her way out of a room. She looked at the approaching agents, then at the bonds in her hand. Panic overrode logic. She scrambled backward, tripping over her couture train, and shoved the stack of papers deep into a floral arrangement, as if hiding a bad report card from a teacher. It was a fatal error. Attempting to conceal evidence during a raid upgrades the charge from possession to obstruction. A tactical officer vaulted the buffet table. He didn't ask her nicely. He didn't care about her dress or her Milan dreams. He tackled her. It was a clean, kinetic takedown. The golden child hit the dirt face first. The sound of zip ties cinching around her wrists was louder than the music had ever been. "Get your hands off her!" my mother shrieked. She lunged at the officer, her silk caftan flapping like broken wings. "Do you know who we are? We are the Brandons. You work for us." An agent intercepted her, forcing her back with a stiff arm. "Ma'am, step back, or you will be detained." My father stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, his face a mask of absolute bewilderment. This is the moment of cognitive dissonance. It is the psychological fracture that occurs when a narcissist's internal reality collides with objective truth. For decades, Brandon and Susan had constructed a world where they were the monarchs, where laws were for poor people, and consequences were things you paid someone else to handle. They had believed their own lie so deeply that the sight of federal agents felt like a hallucination. Their brains couldn't process a scenario where their status didn't function as a shield. They weren't just scared, they were glitching. The crowd parted as the lead agent walked onto the patio. I knew him, Agent Miller. We had worked the Chicago wire fraud case together. He ignored my screaming mother. He walked past my hyperventilating father. He stopped in front of me. He didn't smile. He adjusted his raid jacket and offered a curt nod. "Agent," he said, his voice cutting through the hysteria. "Situation report." I pointed to the floral arrangement where Savannah had tried to bury her future. "Asset compromised and contaminated," I said. My voice was clinical. "Suspect attempted concealment. Chain of custody is broken." Miller signaled to an evidence tech, who began photographing the flowers. Then he looked at my parents. They were staring at me, their eyes wide, the realization finally dawning. They weren't looking at Skylar the data clerk anymore. They were looking at the person who commanded the respect of the men with guns. "Are these the co-conspirators?" Miller asked. I looked at them. I saw the fear, the confusion, and the lingering arrogance that still whispered they could talk their way out of this. "Affirmative," I said. "Process them." The engagement was annulled the next morning. Not by a priest, but by a press release from Austin's family law firm distancing him from the criminal activities of his former partner. The fallout wasn't dramatic, it was clinical. The federal conviction rate is over 90%. When they come for you, they don't miss. Savannah's defense attorney tried to argue ignorance, but the text messages on her phone were damning. My parents hadn't just known about the theft, they had orchestrated it. They had sent her the floor plan of my apartment. They had texted her the combination to the front door, which they had memorized from a previous visit. They had typed the words, "Take whatever you find. She owes us." Susan and Brandon were indicted for conspiracy to commit larceny and money laundering. It turned out the Greenwich estate wasn't just leveraged, It was the hub for washing the cash from the Ponzi scheme I had been investigating. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were actively cleaning dirty money to maintain their lifestyle. They were facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. I didn't visit them. I didn't attend the arraignment. I watched the proceedings on a closed-circuit feed from my new office. 3 weeks after the raid, I was promoted. My clearance was raised to the highest tier for asset recovery. I was assigned to dismantle the domestic arm of the laundering network my parents had helped facilitate. I went back to the house in Greenwich one last time before the marshals changed the locks. It was silent. The furniture had been seized. The art was gone. The only thing left was the outline of frames on the walls, ghostly rectangles where their legacy used to hang. I stood in the living room where I had spent 20 years trying to be good, trying to be quiet, trying to be worthy of love that was never going to come. I felt nothing, no grief, no nostalgia, just the satisfaction of a balanced equation. I left my key on the kitchen counter. I drove back to the city. That night, sitting in my apartment, my real home, paid for with honest work, I opened my contact list. I scrolled to Mom, Dad, and Savannah. I didn't hesitate. I hit delete. One by one, I removed them from my digital life, just as I had removed them from my physical one. I realized then that I hadn't just survived them. I had audited them. I had looked at the balance sheet of our relationship and realized that for decades, I had been operating at a loss. I had poured love, loyalty, and labor into a black hole that only returned criticism and theft. Now, the account was closed. My worth wasn't a resource for them to mine. It was intrinsic. It was mine. I closed my laptop. The screen went black, reflecting my own face. I looked tired, but I looked free. Have you ever had to let someone hit rock bottom because saving them would mean destroying yourself? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if you want to see justice served cold, make sure to follow.